Hey guys, Yuliya here. So this is part 2 of all of the plants I grew from seed video, and in the part 1 I was talking about all of the plants that I grew from seed using winter sowing method, but in today's video I will be talking about all of the plants that I grew from seed, but I started them indoors last year, and I will also mention some of the plants that reseed freely in the garden. Now, most of the plants that I grew from seed last year require a full sun type of situation, which I do not have in my garden. In fact, I will post that satellite image again that I posted in the last video, where you can see large shade trees that cast big shadows over the garden. So the garden is pretty much part shade. That does not stop me from growing these plants, however, because I really like to see the flowers. I really like to try new things every year, and I'm not going for the abundance or quantity, but I just want to see what they look like. There is a small spot in Devil's Strip that receives full sun, or what's considered full sun. It's about 7 hours of sunlight a day, but that's about as sunny as the garden gets. So I will start with Ageratum Blue Planet. And if you're familiar with Ageratums, it's those purple flowers that usually sold in flats in garden centers. And they never seem to grow more than 6 inches across. This one is a totally different Ageratums. These grew to about 1.5 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall. They were more of the sprawling variety. They had longer flower stalks, and they made a great cutting flower and a great filler in bouquets. They're very easy to start from seed. I only started a few because, again, I just wanted to see what they look like. No problems. There was actually one issue in the middle of the summer where they were attacked by a leaf miner, and I took care of that with insecticidal soap. If the problem would have gotten worse, I probably could cut the entire plant all the way to the ground and it would have regrown, because I kept cutting it for bouquets and it kept blooming again. So it definitely benefits from deadheading. And it bloomed all the way from middle of May when I planted it out to almost November. Now these plants, and majority of the plants that I will be talking about today, are frost sensitive. That's why you start them inside, so they can get a head start. So do not plant this one before you make sure that you do not have any frost in your area. The next group of plants are China Asters, and China Asters have a special place in my heart because it was one of the first plants I've ever grown as a kid. Now, I grew several different varieties. The Valkyrie pink was probably my favorite because it had those thin pink petals, and the petals in the middle were sort of swirling, and it looked like a very fine cactus dahlia. Another variety that I really liked was Royal Purple. Obviously purple color, I love purple color. It was a smaller flower, but the color was beautiful. And then Moonstone, which was a paler purple and sort of like a moody, interesting color. Smaller flowers, but there were a lot of them. And the last one I grew was Bengal Rose Frost, which was sent to me as a complimentary pack of seeds. They were doing anniversary of some sort. I don't remember what it was, but it was a white aster. And a lot of times when you have white flowers in the garden, they tend to look a little bit dirty. This was sparkling white flower from the moment it opened to the moment it faded. It was gorgeous. Now, China Asters are not commonly grown in gardens. I'm not sure why, because I love them. I think they're very long lasting. I had one last both in the garden and as a cut flower for 3 weeks or more. They're easy to grow, although I have heard of some people having some germination issues. I think it's more depending on the seed quality than the plant itself. They can get diseases, so you have to rotate them from one spot to another in your garden to make sure that you take care of that. The next plant is Cotton Candy Statice. And this one I grew out of curiosity because I'm not really into dried flowers. But when I saw that on some photographs and botanical renderings, they looked sort of meadowy, flower-like, which I love. So I decided to try these, and they started very well at home. They grew into very healthy seedlings, but then I planted them in the wrong spot. I put them where our holly used to be, that we had to cut down last year, and I know I amended soil so much that it was way too rich for these plants. I think these plants require more of a poor soil and good drainage and very sunny location, which none of those I had in that spot. So they ended up being stretched out and sort of fat. I do not know any other word to describe it. I don't mean to fat shame any plant, but that's what they looked like. Their flower stalk looked almost algae-like, which I think was because there was a lot of nutrients pumping into the plant. I did get a couple of flowers. They weren't that impressive. I do want to try this one again, though, in maybe a different location. The next plant is Nasturtium Black Velvet. And when I saw this in the catalog, I was just curious to grow it because the flower color was that deep brown, almost black color. And also nasturtiums are very easy to grow from seeds, so I decided why not. In the end, the color of the flowers actually turned out to be more of a dirty orange than dark brown or like deep brown color. And it also got a leaf miner infestation in the middle of the summer. And this plant just struggled all the way through the summer. I actually ended up cutting it all the way to the ground, and I think I pulled it by August time. I think this particular nasturtium also did not like to be in the ground because some of them prefer to be either in hanging baskets or a window box or maybe on the edge of a raised bed where they can trail over something. This one, I think it just didn't like to be that close to the ground and it was just turning into mush. Let's talk about sweet peas. Now, I grew sweet peas before, but last year I decided to be serious about it because I wanted a lot of flowers and I wanted them to be prolific. Now, I know they're heavy feeders and they do not like a lot of root disturbance, so I did everything right. I planted them in these very deep cups where if I were to plant them outside, there was minimal root disturbance, and I also fed them with compost and manure while they were growing, and they did really well. I grew two varieties. One was April in Paris, and another one is a Little Sweetheart. Now, April in Paris is a regular height variety. They grow to about 6 feet tall, and I planted them on the obelisks that I bought on the internet, and they looked great. Now, the Little Sweetheart was actually my favorite because it was a sweet pea in a small package. It grew only to 1.5 feet tall. So if you want to try sweet peas, but you do not have a trellis or something to grow up, so they can grow up, you can try this one because they were prolific bloomers. I actually planted them in front of our front door containers because there was this odd sort of period of time where I did not have summer plants there yet, but the spring ones were already gone. So I planted Alyssum and Little Sweetheart there, and they looked beautiful, and they bloomed for a long time. But when our weather starts to heat up, sweet peas, no more. They really do not like the heat and humidity of our summer. But they did really well. I'm so glad I tried these varieties, and I'm definitely trying more this year. The next plant is an unusual one, and it is a purple tear honeywort. And I've seen this plant grown in other places before, but I've never tried it myself. And I'm so glad I did. It has the most unusual color foliage. It's almost a turquoise in color. And then at the end of the flower stalk, there are these small purple bell-shaped flowers that honeybees just adore. I know this flower makes actually a great cut flower. Mine did not grow that tall. They were probably about 1 foot tall. I know these can grow up to 2 feet tall, which I will try for this year for sure. It was just such a different structure in the garden. I loved it. I love the color. I love the flowers. I love everything about this plant, and I think you should try it. The next group of plants I grew were annual vines, and annual vines are so great because for a small investment of a seed packet, you can cover a lot of ground. You can create a privacy screen very quickly. You can cover up an ugly wall. You can grow them up an arbor or a trellis. And a lot of these vines have a lot of decorative elements to them, foliage and the flowers. So for example, the hyacinth bean vine, which I've grown for years, have beautiful foliage, and in July time they start blooming with these stalks of purple pink flowers which turn into purple seed pods, which in my opinion are even more decorative than the flowers. And it covers up a lot of ground very quickly. And also their seeds are extremely decorative too, in my opinion. Now, another vine that I grew last year was cobea, or cup and saucer vine. And it started beautifully indoors. It grew to about 2 feet tall, at which point I decided to plant them outside. And again, it is important to wait for your last frost to pass before you plant any of these outside. And unfortunately, Michael was cleaning up some garden debris, and he sort of dragged it through the area where I planted the cobea, and he pulled all of them out. I tried to save them and put them back in the ground, but they did not recover. So it didn't work out last year, but I have grown this plant before, and they're beautiful. They are a very tall vine. They can grow up to 20 feet tall in a season. But they start blooming later in the season, in our area end of August or around September time. But it is so worth waiting for the blooms because there are these large bell-like flowers. Another annual vine I grew last year was Asarina, Joan, Lorraine. And I do not see this vine grown in the gardens. I'm not sure why, because it's absolutely adorable. It is not one of those vines that will swallow up your house or take over the neighborhood. It's sort of well-behaved vine. It will only grow up to 6 feet tall. In fact, this one I planted on the same obelisks where I grew the sweet peas. And they did great. They have very small leaves, and then around June time they start blooming with these purple blue trumpet looking like flowers, and bees absolutely love those. They're very easy to grow. They're not fussy. It's not like they needed an extra fertilizer or anything, and they even did okay in my part shade situation. Here's another plant I grew out of curiosity, Bunnytails. And this is definitely one of those more interesting plants rather than beautiful. And it is more of a tactile experience. And I do love touching plants and feeling how soft they are. And I think if you have kids, this one is a fun one to grow. Interestingly, the area where I planted it in the garden was visited by a bunny almost every day. I'm not sure why. But it was very easy to start from seed and plant it out in landscape. I think it does prefer a little bit more of a poor soil. And I know some of people grow it for cutting. Mine did not grow tall enough or large enough to look like anything in the bouquet. The next two plants are kind of interesting, and I've never grown them before last year. The first one was African foxglove, and it sort of looked like your regular foxglove, but it did not have as many flowers. So I was a little disappointed about that one, but when the flowers were open, they were absolutely beautiful. And I think the plant was very soft to touch, just like the Bunnytails. The second flower was Chinese foxglove, which also had those interesting tubular looking like flowers, but this was a beautiful pink like color with yellow dotted throat. Now this one I'm a little worried about because it was sort of a perennial, and it seeded all over the place by the end of summer. It was so successful and so prolific. So I am going to keep an eye on it this season and see if it's going to continue to spread around the garden. I'll probably pull it out because I do not want any trouble in the garden. The next plant is a grass that I grew from seed, and it is frosted explosion grass. And I know this one is grown a lot for cut bouquets as a filler, and I absolutely love the look of it. It was this ethereal texture, and it is a switchgrass family, or panicum, which I also have in the garden. I cannot get enough of. This one is very hard to photograph, and you have to photograph it against something black for it to be seen, but in real life you can see that cloud of beautiful seed heads both in the garden and bouquets. I definitely recommend this one. And the last two plants I grew from seed last year were Verbascums. And Verbascums a lot of times thought of as weeds in the garden, but there are a lot of decorative ones nowadays. And the ones that I grew were Shades of Summer and Snowy Spires. And Shades of Summer had these beautiful pastel-y colors of blues and pinks and whites. They were pretty short to my liking. I would have liked them to be a little bit taller. And that was what the seed packet said, though. It was a 1.5 foot tall plant. And the Snowy Spires were a little bit taller, though. And in this picture, you can see it being strangled by a hyacinth bean vine, which I thought was an interesting combination. But Verbascums did pretty well in the garden. However, where I planted them, again, it was a little bit rich soil, and they like more of poor soil conditions. So between cracks of concrete, I think they would be really happy. And I'm definitely trying more Verbascums this year because they provide that height and candle-like structure in the garden that few plants have. So I just have to try to find a really poor soil spot for them in the garden. All right, you guys, these are all of the plants that I grew from seed last year, but I quickly wanted to mention some of the plants that reseed freely in the garden. And the first one is Cleome. And those of you who've been watching my channel, you're probably very familiar with the plant. It's this beautiful ethereal-like structure plant. It is about 4 feet tall. And the colors are all of the colors that I love. These pastel pinks and purples, some white, and they hybridize every year, and I never know what's going to pop up anywhere. And Cleome is interesting because they're pretty easy to grow in the garden when they start to self-seed. But sometimes it's a struggle to germinate them if you decide to grow them yourself, because they want stratification, but they don't just want the cold stratification. They want warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold stratification. So this is what our winters are actually like. We have a lot of warm weather and then some cold and then warm and cold. And that's why they germinate so easily outside. And that's probably why it's best to grow them maybe winter sowing rather than try to grow them indoors. But once you have them started in your garden, you will always have them, because I bought my first Cleome seed packet about 10 years ago and I never had to plant them again. I do occasionally buy the varieties that you can buy in the garden centers, the ones that are a little bit shorter, but generally I don't have to buy them. The second plant that seeds freely are Feverfews, and they're always welcome in my garden because they can grow anywhere. They can grow in the sun, in the shade, they can grow under trees with ton of root competition. So this way, if I have them everywhere in the garden, it creates sort of unity, and my garden looks like it makes sense. They make great cut flower. I love the smell of the foliage. Even in the winter, right now, I have tufts of Feverfews, and if I go out there and crush a couple of leaves, it brings me straight into the summer mode. And the last one is a new one for me, which is Amaranth Dreadlocks. So that one apparently reseeds very happily in my area. And the ones that I had last year that grew giant up to 9 feet tall, they actually reseeded from last year. I'm sorry, from the year before. And I absolutely love them. If they become a nuisance, they're very easy to pull out. And actually all of those plants that I mentioned before, very easy to pull out and trash them in the compost pile. So anyway, this is all for all the plants that I grew from seed last year. And this is a brand new year. I do have some additions that I probably will talk about later, but I think this is enough information for you guys for now. I don't want you to feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, and maybe try out some of these new varieties if you saw some of the new varieties that I talked about. Anyway, thank you so much, you guys, for watching. I hope you learned something new in this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. And very oh, you gross, because in the catalog it looks